He was a Navy SEAL who survived war, but not the silence that followed it. On a frozen night by Lake Superior, he planned to walk home and let the world stay broken. Then his dog stopped. At the end of an abandoned pier, an old woman lay in the snow, shaking, forgotten, written off as unstable. They said her mind was broken, but if that were true, why was a powerful corporation still watching her? What the soldier did not know yet was this. The woman carried a truth meant to disappear. The dog recognized danger before any human could. And God had placed all three of them in the same moment, not by accident, but by purpose. This is not a story about fighting back with violence. It is a story about staying when walking away would have been easier, about how one small act of compassion can expose a lie big enough to shake the world, and about how sometimes the miracle is not what God takes away, but who He asks us to stop for. Stay with us. Winter had settled heavily over Marquette, Michigan, the kind of northern cold that pressed down from the sky and lake at the same time, turning the streets quiet and the air sharp enough to burn the lungs. Ethan Crowell lived in a narrow wooden house set back from the road, close enough to Lake Superior that the wind rattled his windows at night, but far enough that no one passed by unless they had a reason. At 43, Ethan still carried the shape of a soldier, even when standing still. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a posture that never fully relaxed, as if his body had forgotten how. His hair was dark brown, cut short in the regulation style he had never quite let go of, and threaded with early gray at the temples. A scar ran faintly along his left jaw, nearly hidden by a trimmed beard he kept more out of habit than style. His eyes were pale, an unreadable gray, the kind that noticed details without appearing to look directly at them. People who met him briefly described him as polite but distant. People who knew him longer understood that Ethan was not cold. He was careful. Something in him had learned that caring too openly could cost lives. Ethan had been a Navy SEAL for most of his adult life. The teams, the deployments, the long months overseas had given him structure and purpose, a clarity that civilian life never quite replicated. That structure had shattered 2 years earlier during a mission that went wrong in ways that still replayed in his sleep. An explosion, a collapsed structure. 2 men who did not walk out. Ethan did, with shrapnel in his leg and a weight in his chest that no surgery could remove. The Navy had put him on medical leave, then retirement papers followed, neatly typed and impersonal. The war had ended for him on paper. Inside, it never really had. He came to Marquette because it was quiet, and because no one here asked questions. He took contract work when his leg allowed it, repaired boats at the harbor when the weather was forgiving, and learned how to live with days that did not demand anything heroic from him. He told himself he was content with that. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. Staying alive felt easier than deciding what to live for. The only creature that demanded something from Ethan was Ranger. Ranger was a German shepherd, 9 years old, with a thick black and tan coat that had begun to gray around the muzzle. His build was powerful, but no longer effortless. His back legs showed the stiffness of old injuries, and his gait carried the careful economy of a dog who knew how to conserve strength. His ears stood alert more often than not, rotating subtly at distant sounds, and his amber eyes missed very little. Ranger had been trained as a military working dog, deployed alongside Ethan for years, specializing in detection, explosives, unfamiliar chemicals, hidden devices. He had pulled Ethan out from a collapsed corridor once, ignoring commands until his handler was breathing again. That loyalty had never faded, even after nerve damage ended Ranger's service. Retirement had come with medals, paperwork, and a quiet drive north, where the two of them learned how to exist without missions. Ranger was not affectionate in the way of house pets. He did not jump, did not lick faces, did not whine for attention. His presence was steadier than that. He slept near doors, positioned himself between Ethan and strangers, and watched the world with a seriousness that bordered on solemn. Ethan spoke to him rarely and never in long sentences. They understood each other through pauses and glances, through the shared memory of chaos survived. That afternoon, the wind off the lake was particularly sharp. Ethan pulled on a dark coat, heavy boots, and gloves worn thin at the fingertips. Ranger rose as soon as Ethan reached for the leash, moving with deliberate stiffness but unmistakable purpose. They walked the same route every day, down the narrow road toward the harbor, past abandoned warehouses and docked fishing boats resting under sheets of ice. The harbor had once been busy, a place of industry and voices. Now it was mostly steel, wood, and silence. Ethan liked the harbor because it required awareness. The ice shifted, the wind changed direction, and the terrain punished carelessness. It kept his mind occupied without demanding emotional engagement. Ranger walked at his left side, close enough that their shoulders nearly aligned, his breath fogging the air in steady bursts. They reached the edge of the pier where the lake stretched out, dark and vast beneath the low winter sky. Ethan stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, feeling the familiar ache in his leg. He was thinking about nothing in particular when Ranger stopped. It was not a dramatic halt. Ranger simply froze, his body going rigid, head lifting slightly, ears angling forward. His tail stilled. Ethan noticed immediately. Years of working together had trained him to read the smallest changes in Ranger's posture. This was not curiosity. This was recognition. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice low, controlled. Ranger did not look at him, his gaze fixed on the far end of the pier, where shadows pooled between stacked crates and a rusted bollard. The wind carried the sound of ice shifting against wood. Nothing else moved. Ethan followed Ranger's line of sight, scanning the area. He saw nothing out of place. Still, he trusted Ranger more than his own first impressions. He shifted his weight, testing his leg, and took a slow step forward. Ranger moved with him, staying slightly ahead now, his body angled protectively. The moment passed. Ranger relaxed by a fraction, but he did not return to his usual walking pace. Ethan made a mental note and turned them back toward home. Whatever Ranger had sensed was gone, or at least no longer immediate. In the old days, Ethan would have investigated thoroughly. Now he accepted that not every alert required action. Some were simply reminders that the world still contained things worth paying attention to. As they walked back, snow began to fall again, light at first, then thicker, softening the edges of the city. Marquette receded into muted shapes and shadows. Ethan felt the familiar pull toward isolation, the quiet that had become both refuge and prison. He did not hate this life. He just did not fully inhabit it. Back at the house, Ethan wiped Ranger's paws and filled his bowl. Ranger ate methodically, then settled near the door, his preferred place. Ethan stood for a moment, watching him, then turned away. He did not allow himself to wonder what would happen when Ranger was gone. Some questions did not need answers yet. That night the wind intensified, rattling the house and sending waves crashing against the ice. Ethan lay awake longer than usual, listening. Ranger did not move from his position by the door. At some point, Ethan realized that for the first time in months, he was not thinking about the past or the future. He was simply there, breathing, existing in the present moment. He did not know it yet, but that small act, staying instead of withdrawing further, was the first choice that would matter. Snow came down hard and fast, driven sideways by the wind off Lake Superior, turning the harbor into a narrow tunnel of white. Ethan Crowell was already inside his house when Ranger stopped short behind him. The dog did not bark. He did not whine. He simply froze, body stiff, head lifted, ears locked forward. Ethan recognized the posture instantly. This was not curiosity. This was a warning. Ethan turned, watching Ranger's gaze fix on the road leading back toward the pier. For a moment, Ethan considered ignoring it. He was tired. His leg ached. The night was brutal. Then Ranger took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, the way he had done before explosions, before ambushes, before things went wrong. Ethan exhaled once and pulled his coat back on. They moved quickly, snow crunching underfoot. Ranger led, pulling slightly on the leash, his injured leg stiff but steady. Ethan did not speak. He did not need to. The harbor loomed ahead, lights dimmed by falling snow, the lake invisible beyond the pier. Halfway down the wooden boards, Ranger stopped again, sharper this time. Ethan followed his line of sight and saw it. A shape lay near the end of the pier, hunched low against a rusted mooring post. At first glance, it looked like debris. Then it moved. Ethan approached carefully, scanning the shadows, listening past the wind. He smelled it before he heard it. Breath. Shallow. Uneven. Human. He knelt beside the figure, ignoring the protest in his leg. The woman lay curled on her side, coat thin and soaked through, snow clinging to her hair and lashes. She was small, narrow-framed, her body drawn inward as if trying to disappear. Gray hair escaped from beneath a knit hat, pulled too low over her forehead. Her boots were worn past usefulness. She looked fragile, almost breakable, but Ethan had learned not to confuse frailty with helplessness. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm and firm. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, pale blue, sharp. For a brief second, they focused on him with startling clarity. Too clear. Then they drifted, unfocused, and her mouth moved. "I was resting," she said. "Just a minute. I didn't mean to fall asleep." Her speech was slurred, but the sentence was complete. Ethan noticed. Ranger stepped closer, positioning himself between the woman and the open pier, his body angled outward, ears flicking at the darkness behind them. His tail was still, his focus absolute. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. She hesitated. Too long. Then, "Maggie," she said. "Margaret Hensley. People call me Maggie." She frowned slightly, as if unsure whether that answer was correct. Ethan wrapped his scarf around her neck and checked her pulse. Weak, but steady. Not yet hypothermic, but close. He helped her sit up, supporting her weight. She was lighter than she should have been. Her fingers trembled violently. "They don't like it when I wander," she said suddenly, her voice clearer now. "It causes problems." Ethan paused. "Who doesn't?" Her eyes flicked past him toward the lake. The clarity vanished. "Doctors," she murmured. "They say I forget things, that it's safer if I stay put." Ranger let out a low sound, barely audible, his body tensing. Ethan felt the shift immediately. He had heard that sound before, right before danger revealed itself. They moved off the pier quickly. Ethan supported Maggie on one side, Ranger pacing close on the other, adjusting his speed to hers. Snow erased their footprints almost instantly. Maggie stumbled once, gripping Ethan's sleeve with surprising strength. "They watch for patterns," she whispered. "Lights, movement, doors opening where they shouldn't." Ethan did not respond. He kept moving. The diner across the street was the first real shelter they reached. The neon sign flickered in the snow. Sarah's place. Ethan pushed the door open, and warm air rushed out. Sarah Whitman looked up from behind the counter. She was tall, broad-shouldered, in her early 50s, with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed very little. She took in the scene in seconds and asked no questions. "Here," she said, already moving. She wrapped Maggie in a blanket and guided her into a booth. "Coffee's hot, soup in 2 minutes." Maggie's hands shook too badly to hold the cup. Ethan steadied it for her. Ranger lay down at his feet, head up, eyes on the door. "They'll notice the light," Maggie murmured. "They always do." Sarah glanced at Ethan. He gave a slight shake of his head. She nodded and walked away. Maggie sipped the coffee slowly. Her breathing steadied. The sharpness returned briefly to her eyes as she looked at Ethan. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said quietly. "People get hurt when they do." Ethan met her gaze. "You were freezing." She studied him as if weighing something invisible. Then her shoulders sagged, exhaustion winning. Her eyes closed. Ranger did not relax. Outside, the snow kept falling, sealing the harbor behind them. Ethan realized with a strange calm that whatever he had just stepped into, there was no undoing it now. Morning arrived quietly, the storm having burned itself out sometime before dawn. Pale winter light filtered through the diner windows, reflecting off snow piled along the street and turning the harbor into a frozen gray, still life. Ethan Crowell had not slept. He sat in the booth across from Maggie Hensley, hands wrapped around a cooling mug of coffee, watching the small, involuntary movements that passed across her face as she drifted in and out of rest. Ranger lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert enough to track every shift of the room. Maggie woke suddenly, blinking as if startled by her own breath. For a moment she looked genuinely lost, her gaze bouncing from the counter to the door to the window, as though orienting herself in a place that refused to settle. Then she saw Ethan. Something in her expression sharpened. "You didn't leave," she said. "No," Ethan replied. "You needed time." She nodded once, slow and deliberate, then frowned. "I don't always know how much time has passed." Sarah Whitman approached the table with a fresh cup of coffee. In daylight, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent her life standing her ground. She was tall, solidly built, with strong hands and a back that stayed straight even after years of long shifts. Her face held permanent lines of concentration rather than age, the kind carved by responsibility, not regret. Sarah set the cup down without comment, her dark eyes flicking briefly to Maggie, then to Ethan, then to Ranger. She had seen enough broken people pass through her diner to recognize when someone carried damage that ran deeper than the surface. Maggie reached for the cup, then hesitated, her hand hovering uncertainly. Ethan slid it closer. She accepted the help without embarrassment. "I used to be steady," Maggie said abruptly, staring into the coffee. "Hands didn't shake, mine didn't slip." She let out a short, humorless breath. "That was before they said I was useful." Ethan leaned back slightly, giving her space. "Who said that?" She hesitated again, longer this time. When she looked up, the fog was still there, but behind it, something else moved with intent. "The company," she said. "Redwood Therapeutics." The name landed heavily in the quiet diner. Sarah paused near the counter, her attention sharpening without her turning around. Ethan felt Ranger's body tense at his feet, a subtle shift, muscles coiling. "I worked as a nurse," Maggie continued. "Army Nurse Corps, 26 years. Her voice steadied as she spoke, muscle memory asserting itself. "Field hospitals, rehab units, veterans clinics. I knew how to follow protocol, how to keep people alive when they were already half gone." She rubbed her temples, pressing as if trying to hold something in place. "When I retired, they contacted me, said they needed experienced medical personnel for a civilian research program. Said it would help soldiers like the ones I'd cared for." Ethan didn't interrupt. He had heard this kind of story before, different names, same shape. "They called it neurological resilience," Maggie said, "a way to strengthen cognitive recovery after trauma. PTSD, brain injuries. They needed volunteers, too, people who trusted them." Her mouth twisted faintly. "People like me." Her eyes flickered, unfocused now, then snapped back with alarming clarity. "I signed the forms. I read them. I swear I did. But the language was dense, and I believed them." Ranger lifted his head, ears rotating, as a truck passed outside. He relaxed again when the sound faded, but he didn't lie back down. "The first doses were mild," Maggie went on. "Headaches, fatigue, Memory gaps they said were temporary. I reported everything. That was my job. She laughed softly, without humor. Turns out that made me a better subject. Ethan felt a familiar anger stir, slow and controlled. What did the drug do? Her answer came in pieces. Short-term memory fractures, disorientation, periods of clarity that didn't last. She tapped the table once, sharply. But it didn't erase everything, not the important parts, not what I saw. Sarah finally turned around, leaning her weight against the counter, arms crossed. She didn't speak, but her presence grounded the room. They didn't like that, Maggie said. They wanted compliance, forgetfulness, gratitude. Her jaw tightened. When I started asking questions, they changed my status. Subject no longer suitable, cognitive decline, early onset impairment. She looked up at Ethan. They wrote it down, and once it was on paper, it became truth. Ethan nodded slowly. They cut you loose. Yes, Maggie said, but not cleanly. She gestured vaguely at her head. The drug didn't just stop working because they wanted it to. Some days I'm sharp, some days I lose hours. They used that. Told me I was a liability. A risk. Her eyes hardened. They didn't count on me understanding exactly what that meant. Ranger stood and moved closer to Maggie, sniffing carefully near her coat. He paused, then stiffened, a low vibration running through his chest. Ethan noticed immediately. What is it? Ethan asked quietly. Maggie watched the dog with interest. He smells it, doesn't he? Smells what? The medication, she said. It lingers. They said it metabolizes fully, but it doesn't. Not completely? Ethan felt a chill unrelated to the cold. Ranger had been trained to detect chemical compounds, explosives, unfamiliar substances. If he was reacting now, it meant something remained. They marked you, Ethan said. Maggie nodded. Not on purpose. Not like a tracker. She hesitated. At first. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the harbor lay quiet and exposed. They thought I was done. Too unstable to be believed. Too confused to organize anything. She smiled faintly. That was their mistake. Sarah cleared her throat. You got somewhere safe to go? She asked, her voice practical. Maggie shook her head. Every place I've tried, they find me eventually. Shelters, clinics, temporary housing. She looked at Ethan. Patterns? That's how they watch. Ethan absorbed that without comment. He glanced down at Ranger, whose focus had shifted from Maggie to the door again, posture alert. You didn't imagine this, Ethan said finally. They made you look unreliable so no one would listen. Maggie studied him closely. You believe me? I do, Ethan said. He didn't elaborate. Belief didn't require justification. For a moment, Maggie's composure cracked. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked every bit her age, worn thin by exhaustion and vigilance. They wanted my mind broken, she said quietly. Not destroyed, just unreliable enough to dismiss. Ranger lay back down, but his eyes stayed open. Outside, the daylight strengthened, revealing the full stillness of the frozen harbor. Ethan realized something then, with a clarity that surprised him. Maggie wasn't just damaged. She was discarded, written off as collateral. And whatever Redwood Therapeutics had tried to erase, they had failed to finish the job. Ethan finished his coffee and stood. You shouldn't stay here long, he said. Too visible. Maggie nodded, understanding more than her condition should have allowed. I was hoping you'd say that. The choice had already been made. Ethan felt it settle into place, heavy and certain. He wasn't fixing anything yet. He wasn't fighting anyone. He was doing something simpler and harder. He was refusing to let them finish what they started. The decision to leave came without ceremony. Ethan Crowell paid the bill, nodded once to Sarah Whitman, and guided Maggie Hensley out the back door of the diner where the alley opened toward the frozen harbor. Snow had stopped, but the cold remained sharp and alert, the kind that punished hesitation. Ranger moved first, his posture tight, nose low, drawing a shallow arc around Maggie before settling at Ethan's left. He did not relax when they reached the truck. He circled again, slower this time, inhaling deeply near Maggie's coat, then paused, muscles coiling as if a wire had been pulled tight beneath his skin. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Ranger's ears flattened slightly, not in fear, but concentration. His tail went still. He pressed his nose to the fabric at Maggie's sleeve and drew back with a quiet, unsettled sound that Ethan had heard only a handful of times in the past. That sound had always preceded something that mattered. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, keeping his voice even. Maggie watched the dog with a look that was not surprise but recognition. She shifted her weight, discomfort flickering across her face. "It's still there," she said softly. "I tried to wash it out. It doesn't come all the way off." They loaded into the truck quickly. Ethan kept the engine off for a moment, scanning the street through the windshield. Nothing moved. No headlights lingered. No doors opened. Still, Ranger remained rigid, eyes fixed forward, tracking something Ethan could not see. Ethan drove the long way home, avoiding main roads, habits from a former life guiding him without conscious thought. Maggie sat upright in the passenger seat, hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked steadier now, the fog in her eyes thinner, though fatigue pulled at her features. In better light, Ethan could see the lines carved by years of responsibility rather than age alone. She had been precise once, orderly. That kind of discipline did not vanish completely, no matter what chemicals tried to erase it. At the house, Ranger refused to enter at first. He stopped on the threshold, head turning sharply from Maggie to the surrounding darkness. Ethan waited, letting the dog work. Ranger stepped back, then forward again, nose low, tracing an invisible path that circled Maggie once more before finally crossing inside. Only then did Ethan close the door. The house was quiet, spare, functional. Maggie stood just inside, taking it in with the careful attention of someone used to reading rooms for danger. Ethan handed her a heavy sweater and nodded toward the bathroom. "Hot water," he said. "Take your time." She hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. Ranger followed halfway, stopping at the corner where he could watch both the hallway and the front door. Ethan knelt and ran a hand along the dog's back, feeling the tension coiled there. "You smelled it?" Ethan said quietly. "Not just residue." Ranger did not respond, but his eyes stayed locked on the hallway. When Maggie returned, wrapped in the sweater, her coat draped over her arm, Ranger stood again, more alert than before. He approached the coat with deliberate slowness, nose hovering just above the fabric. His reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He recoiled slightly, then leaned in again, nostrils flaring, a low, insistent sound vibrating through his chest. Ethan took the coat and laid it flat on the table. He examined the seams with methodical care, fingers tracing stitches, pockets, linings. Maggie watched him, her expression guarded, but calm. "They didn't implant anything in me," she said. "I wouldn't have survived that." "I'm not looking for that," Ethan replied. Ranger's nose stopped at the inside hem. He pressed there, then lifted his head and looked directly at Ethan, holding his gaze. The message was clear. This was not scent alone. This was location. Ethan retrieved a small blade from the drawer and worked carefully, slicing along the seam with controlled precision. Maggie did not protest. When the lining came free, a small, dark object slipped into Ethan's palm. It was no larger than a coin, smooth, unmarked, with a faint adhesive residue clinging to one side. Maggie closed her eyes briefly. "That's new," she said. "They must have added it after I left the facility." Ethan examined the device, turning it slowly between his fingers. It was not medical, it was not consumer grade, it was designed to be unobtrusive, durable, and reliable. He felt a familiar clarity settle in his chest. "They weren't letting you go," Ethan said. "They were keeping you visible." Maggie nodded. "I suspected. I just didn't know where." Ranger relaxed by a fraction, the immediate threat identified. He lay down near the table, head up, eyes still alert, but no longer fixed on Maggie. Ethan sealed the device in a metal container and moved it to the garage, placing it far from the house. When he returned, Maggie was standing by the window, staring out into the dark. "They always underestimated the dogs," she said quietly. "The systems were built around people, cameras, patterns of behavior. They never accounted for instinct." Ethan studied her profile. Without the coat, she looked smaller, but there was nothing fragile about the way she held herself now. Her shoulders were squared. Her breathing was steady. The woman who had collapsed on the pier was still there, but she was not the whole story. "You knew they'd track you," Ethan said. "I knew they'd watch," Maggie replied. "Tracking implies urgency. They didn't think I was worth that yet." "And now?" "And now," she said, meeting his gaze, "they will." Ethan poured water and set it in front of her. "Tell me what else you kept." Maggie hesitated, then reached into the small bag she carried everywhere. From inside she pulled a folded notebook, edges worn soft, pages marked with careful, deliberate handwriting. Dates, dosages, names, observations. The entries were uneven, gaps where days had been lost, followed by pages of startling clarity. "I couldn't trust my memory," she said. "So I wrote everything down, on days when I was clear, hid it when I wasn't." Ethan flipped through the pages, recognizing the structure immediately. This was not rambling. This was documentation. "They labeled you unstable," he said. "They needed me dismissed," Maggie replied. "It's easier when people believe it's already too late." Outside, a car passed slowly on the road, headlights sweeping across the front of the house before moving on. Ranger's head snapped up, tracking the sound until it faded. Ethan closed the notebook. "They'll realize the signal went quiet," Ethan said. "Soon." Maggie nodded. "They'll adjust." Ethan felt the decision harden into place. He had crossed a line already. The quiet life he had built could not coexist with what sat on his table now. Ranger rose and moved to the door, settling into a guard position he had not assumed since his working days. Ethan met Maggie's eyes. "You weren't abandoned," he said. "You were managed." She allowed herself a thin smile. "That's worse." He nodded. "And it means you still matter to them." The house settled into silence again, but it was no longer empty. The truth had a presence now, tangible and alert. Ranger lay at the threshold, vigilant. Ethan stood in the center of the room, notebook in hand, understanding finally what the dog had known before he did. Maggie Hensley was not lost. She was being watched. And that meant whatever she carried was valuable enough for someone to come looking. The house went dark by choice, not by chance. Ethan Crowell killed the lights one by one, leaving only the low glow from the stove clock and the faint spill of moonlight through the snow-frosted windows. The quiet sharpened immediately. Ranger responded at once, moving off the doorway and positioning himself between Maggie Hensley and the front of the house, body angled, head slightly lowered, every muscle engaged. This was not anxiety. This was preparation. Maggie sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug she no longer drank from. Her posture was straighter now, her movements more deliberate. The fog in her mind hadn't vanished, but it had thinned enough for urgency to push through. "They didn't say I was dangerous," she said. "They said I was incapable." Ethan stayed standing. "That's easier to sell." "Yes," Maggie replied quickly. "And harder to challenge." She opened her notebook and flipped to a page marked by a folded corner. The handwriting there was tighter, more controlled. Clear day writing. They convened a review board, she said. 3 people. None of them had known me before the trial. None of them looked at my service record beyond the summary. Ranger's ears flicked. Ethan watched the dog, then Maggie. They asked questions designed to fail, she continued, faster now. Timelines while I was still medicated. Dates that overlapped with drug-induced gaps. They documented hesitation as confusion, confusion as decline. Her jaw set. Then they stamped it permanent. Ethan exhaled slowly. And that gave them legal cover. Yes. Once the diagnosis existed, everything else followed automatically. She gestured sharply with one hand. Hospital privileges revoked, nursing license flagged, my name pushed into every shared database. She looked up at him. After that, no one questions the conclusion, they just inherit it. Ranger shifted closer to the table, placing himself between Maggie and the hallway. He was listening now, tracking more than voices. They said they'd support me, Maggie went on. Temporary housing, case managers, approved clinics. Her mouth twisted. All contingent on compliance. And you stopped complying. I stopped taking the drug, she said. That was the real line. Ethan nodded. He had seen that moment before, the instant a system decided you were no longer manageable. They didn't confront me, Maggie said. Not at first. They waited. Her fingers tapped the table once, sharp and controlled. They let the gaps work, let the instability compound. Missed appointments turned into noncompliance, noncompliance into risk. Ranger's head snapped toward the window. Ethan followed the movement, heart rate steady, eyes scanning. Nothing visible. Still, he didn't relax. They expected me to disappear, Maggie said. That's how it usually ends. Ethan's voice was low. But you didn't. No. Her eyes sharpened. I started moving. She spoke faster now, the words coming cleanly. I changed shelters, clinics. I reached out to 2 former colleagues who hadn't updated their systems yet, asked questions about Redwood's trial expansion. Her lips pressed together. That's when they noticed. Ranger rose to his feet, pacing once, then stopping behind Ethan's chair. They sent a man, Maggie said. No badge, no paperwork. He spoke gently, used words like concern and support. Her shoulders tightened. He asked me to come in for reassessment. Ethan didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. I said no, Maggie continued. I cited patient rights, informed consent, the things I used to teach. She laughed once, short and dry. That was the last time anyone from Redwood spoke to me directly. Ethan leaned forward. What changed after? Pressure, Maggie said immediately. Quiet pressure. She ticked it off with her fingers. Housing placements canceled without explanation. Appointments lost in the system. Welfare checks triggered at inconvenient times. She met his eyes. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to exhaust me. Ranger let out a low sound, barely audible. Ethan rested a hand briefly on the dog's back. They labeled me transient, Maggie said. Unreliable. That made everything else easier. Her voice dropped. People don't look for patterns in people they think are already lost. Ethan nodded once. Until you weren't. Maggie's gaze flicked to the metal container sitting on the counter, hidden but not forgotten. The tracker means something shifted, internally. She spoke with certainty now. They don't deploy resources like that unless someone flags a risk. You became active again, Ethan said. Yes, she replied. I reached out one more time, someone higher up, someone who knew what the drug was really meant to do. Her breath hitched, then steadied. After that, the tone changed. Ranger moved to the door again, sitting squarely in front of it. Guard mode. Final. They decided I wasn't just unstable, Maggie said. I was inconvenient. Silence fell hard. The house seemed smaller now, tighter around the truth sitting between them. They didn't want to correct the record, Ethan said. They wanted to end it. Yes, Maggie didn't hesitate. Erasure failed. Now it's containment. She looked at him. And containment always escalates. Ethan felt the familiar clarity settle in his chest. This wasn't theory. It was pattern recognition. They think my mind is broken, Maggie said, that whatever I remember is unreliable. Her eyes locked onto his. They're counting on no one believing me. Ethan closed the notebook and slid it out of sight. They don't know about Ranger. No, Maggie agreed, and they don't know I kept copies. Outside, tires crunched briefly on snow. Ranger stiffened. Ethan held still. The sound passed. No stop, no door. The moment stretched, then released. Maggie exhaled slowly. That's new, she said. What is? They're checking response time now, she replied. Not contact, just proximity. Ethan nodded. They're narrowing the window. Maggie looked tired suddenly, the clarity draining just enough to show the cost beneath it. I was useful to them once, she said quietly. That's why they chose me. And now? Now I'm a liability, she finished. Ethan stood. Then we don't let them control the timeline. Ranger turned his head, watching Ethan, tail still, ready. Maggie studied both of them, something like resolve settling in her expression. They thought breaking my mind would make the truth harmless. Ethan met her gaze. They made the wrong assumption. The house remained dark. The threat was no longer abstract. Redwood Therapeutics had moved from neglect to intent. Maggie Hensley was no longer just being watched. She was being closed in on. And Ethan understood exactly what that meant. They did not leave at dawn. Ethan Crowell waited until the morning traffic thinned, until routine returned to the roads, and anonymity became easier to wear. He packed light, no weapons laid out in the open, no confrontational posture. Ranger watched every movement with quiet attention, tail still, eyes tracking hands, doors, windows. Maggie Hensley sat at the table, alert but conserving energy, the sharpness in her gaze returning in focused intervals. I'm not fighting them, Ethan said as he closed the last drawer. That's what they expect. Maggie nodded. They expect escalation, panic, noise. So we don't give them that, Ethan replied. We make you visible in the right places. They left the house separately. Maggie rode in the passenger seat, Ranger in the back, posture calm but ready. Ethan drove west toward Duluth, choosing routes that bent and doubled back, habits resurfacing without effort. He did not speak much. Maggie didn't either. Silence, when used correctly, was an advantage. Their first stop was a public library near the waterfront, a modern glass building with constant foot traffic and security cameras that belonged to the city, not a corporation. Ethan parked 2 blocks away and walked in with Maggie and Ranger at his side. Ranger wore no vest. He didn't need one. His presence alone was explanation enough. Inside, Ethan led Maggie to a quiet corner table. He handed her a burner phone, already charged, already loaded with a single contact. That's who, he said. You talk. I don't. Maggie studied the phone. You trust them. I trust what they do, Ethan replied. The journalist answered on the 3rd ring. His name was Daniel Moore, early 40s, lean, sharp-faced, with the posture of someone who lived behind a desk but never let it soften him. Years earlier, he had exposed a veterans' housing fraud ring that had cost several people their lives. The story had nearly ended his career. It had also hardened him. Maggie spoke quietly, deliberately. She did not rush. She laid out facts, dates, drug identifiers, Redwood internal terminology that had never appeared in public filings. Daniel did not interrupt. He only asked for clarification when necessary. I can't promise anything, he said finally. "But this isn't nothing." "That's all I need," Maggie replied. "Someone to look?" When the call ended, Maggie's shoulders sagged slightly. The effort had cost her. Ethan nodded once and stood. "One more door," he said. The law office was smaller, older, tucked between a bakery and a print shop. The name on the door read, Helen Brooks. Inside, the space was neat, utilitarian, lined with binders and framed certifications rather than decor. Helen Brooks herself was in her late 50s, compact, with silver hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She had built her career protecting whistleblowers who had nothing left to lose. Years earlier, she had lost a brother in a pharmaceutical trial that had quietly settled out of court. It had shaped her into someone who did not trust corporate apologies. Helen listened as Maggie spoke, occasionally asking a question, never once questioning Maggie's credibility when her words faltered. She examined the notebook carefully, fingers gentle but precise. "They declared you incompetent," Helen said. "But they kept watching." "Yes," Maggie replied. "That matters," Helen said. "A lot?" She looked at Ethan then. "You're not filing anything." "No," Ethan said. "I'm moving her." Helen nodded. "Good. I'll handle the rest." By the time they left, the snow had begun again, light but persistent. Ethan drove north this time toward a small cabin owned by an old teammate who had learned long ago that sometimes the safest places were the ones with no official purpose. The cabin sat near a frozen inlet, far from cell towers, far from routine patrols. When they arrived, Ranger exited first, scanning the perimeter before allowing Maggie to step out. Inside, the cabin was simple, warm, quiet, a place to breathe. Maggie sat by the window, looking out over the ice. "You didn't save me," she said after a while. Ethan shook his head. "No, I kept a door open." Ranger lay down between them, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but aware. "That's all I needed," Maggie said. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere far away, systems would be adjusting. Legal teams would be asking questions. Analysts would be noticing anomalies. The truth had not exploded into the world. It had simply refused to disappear. And that, Ethan knew, was enough to change everything. The truth did not arrive like a storm. It moved the way pressure moves through ice, silent at first, then inevitable. Ethan Crowell learned that lesson early in the morning when the burner phone vibrated on the cabin table. Ranger lifted his head instantly, eyes alert, body still. Maggie Hensley was awake already, seated near the window with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the pale light crawl across the frozen inlet. Ethan answered without speaking. "It's live," Daniel Moore said on the other end. His voice was steady, but beneath it ran a current of something like restrained disbelief. "Not just one outlet, 3, 2 national. 1 medical journal ran an abstract overnight." Ethan closed his eyes once. "Federal?" "Yes," Daniel replied. Health and Human Services opened a formal inquiry. Justice followed within the hour. "They're coordinating?" Ethan ended the call and turned to Maggie. She had gone very still. "They heard you," he said. Maggie didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, as if a weight she had been carrying for years had shifted enough to let her breathe. By noon, the cabin's satellite connection hummed with activity. Helen Brooks called twice. The first to confirm filings had been accepted under whistleblower protections. The second to say something had changed. "They're not just responding," Helen said. "They're scrambling." Maggie sat closer to the table now, focus sharpening. "That means other people are talking." "Yes," Helen replied. "Former trial coordinators. A data analyst who quit and never said why. 2 nurses who thought they were alone." She paused. They weren't. The witnesses appeared cautiously at first, then with gathering confidence. Records surfaced that Redwood Therapeutics had certified as destroyed. Internal emails appeared with language too precise to dismiss as misunderstanding. Risk tolerance, acceptable degradation, patient attrition thresholds. Words that had once lived safely behind firewalls now carried names and dates. Ranger lay at Ethan's feet, relaxed for the first time in days. The threat had shifted. It was no longer personal. It was procedural, and procedures left trails. Redwood responded the way institutions always did: statements, denials, carefully worded acknowledgments that referenced commitment to safety without addressing specifics. Stock prices dipped, stabilized, then dipped again when a second wave of reporting linked Redwood's neurological trials to 3 other subsidiaries operating under different names. Ethan did not watch the coverage. Maggie did. She watched quietly, sometimes confused by the speed, sometimes startlingly clear as she recognized faces, phrases, protocols she had once helped enforce. "They used the same language," she said once, pointing at the screen. "They never changed it." The federal investigation expanded. Subpoenas followed. Executives were called in, not for interviews, but depositions. The difference mattered. Facilities were audited. Servers were seized. A trial site in Arizona was shut down within 48 hours after inspectors found records that contradicted published outcomes. Witnesses came forward with stories that echoed Maggie's. Memory loss explained away. Side effects minimized. Careers quietly ended. One man, a former logistics supervisor, described being instructed to reclassify adverse events under a different code. He said he had done it because it was easier than asking what would happen if he didn't. Redwood's leadership resigned in stages. First a vice president, then a chief medical officer. Each departure framed as personal. None of them denied the allegations outright anymore. They couldn't. There were too many voices now. Too many documents. Too many witnesses whose stories aligned without having coordinated. Helen called again near dusk. "They're freezing assets," she said. "Not just Redwood, parent holdings, shell foundations." Maggie closed her eyes briefly. They always moved money faster than accountability. "Not this time," Helen replied. "They're outpaced." The weight of it settled slowly. This was not a victory. It was exposure, the kind that stripped away the illusion of control and left only consequence behind. That night, the cabin remained quiet. Ranger slept deeply. Old injuries finally allowed rest. Ethan stood outside for a long time, breathing in the cold air, watching the faint glow of distant lights across the ice. He felt the familiar pull of vigilance ease, replaced by something he had not expected. Stillness. Maggie joined him on the porch, wrapped in her blanket, her breath fogging softly in the air. "I thought they'd come for me," she said. "One last time." "They won't," Ethan replied. "Not now," she nodded. "Too many eyes." "Yes?" Redwood Therapeutics did not collapse in a single moment. It fractured, lawsuits multiplied, investigations overlapped, insurance providers withdrew coverage, research partners severed ties. Each action small, defensible on its own, but together they dismantled the structure that had protected the company for years. A week later, Daniel Moore sent a final message. One line: "Federal indictments unsealed." Maggie read it twice. Then she set the phone down and leaned back, exhaustion overtaking clarity at last. "It's strange," she said. "I remember things better now." Ethan didn't answer. He understood. Memory returned when fear receded. By the end of the month, Redwood's name had become shorthand for institutional failure. Committees formed, policies rewritten. Not enough, never enough. But more than there had been before. Maggie's testimony was taken remotely, carefully, with accommodations. She spoke in fragments sometimes, paused to check notes, corrected herself when the fog rolled in. No one questioned her credibility. Not anymore. There were too many others saying the same things. The truth had witnesses now. That was the difference. Ethan watched from the cabin as the season began to shift. Snow softened. Light lingered longer in the evenings. Ranger moved more easily, tail wagging when Maggie laughed at something small and ordinary. The danger that had once pressed so close had receded into something distant and procedural. Redwood Therapeutics did not survive the year, and Maggie Hensley was no longer alone. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in thin slices of warmth, in mornings that held light a little longer, in snow that retreated without ceremony. The cabin stood unchanged at the edge of the inlet, but the world around it softened. Ethan Crowell noticed it first in Ranger's gait. The old German shepherd moved with less caution now, his steps looser, his tail lifting when the sun reached the porch boards. He chose the warmest patch and settled there, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded in contentment earned over years of vigilance. Maggie Hensley watched from inside, a mug cradled in both hands. She looked different these days, not younger, but steadier. The lines in her face no longer pulled downward with constant strain. Her hair, once perpetually hidden under hats and scarves, was brushed back neatly, silver catching the light. The fog still came and went, but it no longer frightened her. It passed like weather now, not like a threat. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Plain envelope. Government seal. Ethan placed it on the table and waited while Maggie opened it herself. Her hands trembled only slightly. She read it once, then again. Then she laughed, a quiet sound that startled her into covering her mouth. "They corrected it," she said, disbelief giving way to something warmer. All of it. The findings were brief and decisive. Her diagnosis rescinded, her records amended, her service restored. The language was dry, procedural, but the meaning was clear. Maggie Hensley had never been incompetent. She had been wronged. "They apologized," she added softly. "In writing." Ethan nodded. He knew better than to measure justice by tone. What mattered was permanence. The calls followed. Veterans Affairs, a nursing board representative who spoke carefully, respectfully, as if aware of how fragile trust could be. An invitation to consult, if she wished. Maggie declined most of it. She accepted only what felt necessary. "I don't need to go back," she said later, standing at the window. "I just needed them to stop pretending I was never there." She chose to stay near the water. A small rental closer to town, modest and bright, with a view of the harbor that no longer felt hostile. She kept the cabin visits frequent. Some routines did not need to end to prove survival. Sarah Whitman drove up one afternoon with a basket of bread and a look that tried unsuccessfully to hide relief. She stood awkwardly on the porch, hands in her coat pockets, eyes crinkling when she smiled. "I figured you'd both still be here," she said. "Seemed like the kind of place that keeps people who need keeping." Maggie hugged her without hesitation. Sarah stiffened, then relaxed, arms settling firmly around Maggie's shoulders. Years ago, Sarah had lost a sister to an overdose the system had labeled accidental. It had left her skeptical of official explanations and fiercely loyal to those who slipped through the cracks. Ranger lifted his head and thumped his tail once in greeting. Sarah crouched and scratched behind his ears, careful of his hips. "You look good," she told him, "like you finally believe it's quiet." Ranger closed his eyes. Agreement? Ethan found himself spending less time scanning horizons and more time noticing small things. The way Maggie hummed when she cooked, the way Ranger followed the sun across the porch in deliberate increments. The way sleep came easier, without the old calculations running beneath it. One evening, Maggie brought out the notebook. It was thinner now, pages removed, others rewritten. "I don't need it the same way," she said, "but I'm keeping it." Ethan understood. Some records were for memory, others were for proof. The federal proceedings continued without them. Redwood's name faded from headlines, replaced by policy discussions and institutional reforms that never quite captured the cost. It didn't matter. The outcomes did. Funds reallocated. Oversight strengthened. Not perfect, never perfect, but better than silence. Ethan received an email he did not expect. A former teammate, long retired, asking if he would consider consulting. Not returning, just advising, teaching patterns, sharing what experience could without demanding more than he had to give. He didn't answer immediately. He walked outside instead, sitting on the porch beside Ranger. The dog opened one eye, then rested his head against Ethan's boot. "I think I might," Ethan said aloud, surprising himself with how right it felt. Ranger's tail moved once. Enough. Maggie joined them, lowering herself carefully into the chair beside Ethan. She watched the light stretch across the ice, thin and brilliant. "I used to think survival was an accident," she said, "that if I just kept my head down, I'd disappear into it." Ethan didn't respond right away. He waited until the thought settled. "I used to think surviving meant leaving everything behind." Maggie smiled at that. "Turns out it means staying." They sat together in the quiet, no urgency pressing in. Ranger slept, dreaming perhaps of fields that did not require vigilance. Later, when Maggie left for the night, Ethan stood alone on the porch. The stars were sharp and numerous, the air clean. He felt the old ache in his leg, the reminder of what had been lost, but it no longer defined the shape of his days. He had not survived to disappear. He had survived to remain, to hold space, to recognize when something fragile still needed guarding, and when it was finally safe to rest. Ranger shifted, waking enough to press closer. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling warmth and steady breath beneath his palm. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like something to endure. It felt like something that could be lived, and winter finally was over. Sometimes the miracle is not that God stops the storm. Sometimes the miracle is that He sends someone into it. In this story, no angel came down from the sky, no voice thundered from heaven. Instead, a tired man stopped when he could have walked away. A wounded dog trusted its instincts, and a woman who was meant to disappear refused to forget the truth. That is how God often works. He places compassion where indifference would be easier. He places courage in ordinary people who think they have nothing left to give. He places truth in fragile hands and trusts that someone will help carry it. If you are watching this and you feel forgotten, abandoned, or erased by life, remember this: you are not invisible. You are not disposable. And your story is not over. And if you are someone who still has strength, still has breath, still has the ability to stop and help, then maybe you are the answer to someone else's prayer. Do not walk past suffering. Do not assume someone else will act. Do not underestimate what one act of kindness can change. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from so we can pray for you. Subscribe to this channel if you believe stories like this matter. And if you believe that God still works through compassion, through courage, and through ordinary people who choose to stay. Please type Amen in the comments. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May He give you eyes to see suffering and a heart brave enough to respond. And may He send you companions, two-legged or four-legged, to walk beside you until the light returns. Amen.